Dr. Brown is a clinical psychologist, and most importantly now, she is the Chancellor of Research at the University of California in San Diego. So she is well respected in Washington and across the nation as a leading researcher in this area. And I'm just thrilled that we're able to bring this presentation to you. So, Sandy, it's yours. We just decided the questions were too easy for you, but here we go.
That's okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be with you all today and to talk a little bit about teen drinking and how it may affect children's and adolescents and young adults' learning abilities and the process. And hopefully we'll be covering some things that are very useful for parents to know, and also which I think, as a parent myself, made it easier to talk to my children as they move through adolescence. First of all, I think many of us, as we reflect back on our own youth, we think, well, geez, what's the big deal about adolescents drinking? Many people sitting in the audience today and around the country drank when they were adolescents, and so the question is this something we should really be concerned about? And we know a whole lot more now than we knew a decade ago or 2 decades ago or those many decades ago when we were all adolescents. And we know some of these things from our studies with adolescents, but we also know some of this from animal research, because there are certain types of things that we can study with animals that we can't study with humans and really would not want to study. So for example, some of the animal research shows us that alcohol really does affect adolescents differently than it affects adults. For example, most adults who would have several drinks in a row, maybe even up to a binge, might feel pretty sedated. Mm-hmm. But for adolescents, they're less responsive to the sedative effects of alcohol. So they can drink a lot, have very high blood alcohol concentrations, but seem much more alert, less affected by alcohol when they're in the midst of that episode. We know that from animals, and we have self-reports of that for adolescents as well. The flip side of that is that adolescents, animals and humans, appear to be much more sensitive to the impact of alcohol on memory and on what we consider to be transmission between different parts of the brain, like the hippocampus to the cortex or frontal lobe. That helps in decision making in the midst of an alcohol episode. So teens are more sensitive. Their judgment is more disrupted under the influence of alcohol than it would be for adults. And another thing we know from self-reports of teens, but also from even observing all types of animals, whether we're talking about monkeys or we're talking about mice, that social facilitation is accentuated under the influence of alcohol, that there is more of an impact of being in a social environment to one's behavior under the influence of alcohol if you're an adolescent than if you're an adult. Doesn't surprise many of us parents. We know that teens are dramatically affected by their peers. Another thing that I think is really important to understand is that what we would call binge drinking, that is high dose drinking, has really pronounced effects, and those are the effects that we as parents should be most concerned about. The evidence with animals and the evidence with humans suggests that there are long-lasting memory effects, and the animal research shows that there are actual damage to the frontal and anterior cortical regions, and it takes a longer time for neurons to repair after they've been exposed to alcohol. So that means that the kinds of things that are important in learning and good judgment and complex reasoning, the sorts of things we want our adolescents to develop, it can be impaired in a more pronounced way if they're exposed to alcohol during adolescence as opposed to just being exposed as an adult. So binge drinking's bad.
Yes.
That's the bottom
Yes.
line.
Right.
Binge drinking's bad. The animal research, this is some that we can't quite do with humans, where they do post-mortems, that is, after they've studied the animals, then they look at their brains after they've passed away, find that there are important differences in the brains of animals that have been exposed to high doses of alcohol over long periods of time, and particularly in the cortex, which is the planning for sort of purposeful problem solving, anticipating part of the brain, and the hippocampus, the part that's important for memory and new learnings. So we have information from both animals and from humans that shows us that adolescents are more vulnerable, not less vulnerable, to alcohol. And I think that is not the way we thought about alcohol in the past.
I think you're right, and I'm out here babysitting with 3 teenagers. So you all say a prayer for me for this weekend as I get through the weekend with 3 teenagers. And one of my grandsons said to me when I was looking at these slides and saying how wonderful this is, and of course his reaction was, well, Mama, I'm sure that if you don't drink, then everything it just returns to normal.
Ah, good question. Good question. Let me shift to the next slide and share with you a little bit about what we found about alcohol's impact.
Okay.
And in a study done sometime about a decade ago now that launched considerable interest in this area, we looked at teens. They were 15 and 16 years old primarily. And we looked at how their thinking abilities were affected and how they were functioning if they had at least 100 alcohol use episodes. Mm-hmm. So why did we choose 100? Well, there was no guidance at that time. Mm-hmm. But we know that teens tend to drink on the weekends mm-hmm. as opposed to during the week. And that if you were 16 or 17 and you had 100 use episodes, that would mean that probably for the past couple of years you'd been drinking pretty regularly, mm-hmm. or if you were a heavy drinker, you might have been binging almost every weekend. And what we found that in that study was that teens who had at least 100 use episodes, and we didn't say they had to have binges, just that even 100 use episodes, that we found that they could not remember as much of the information that might be shared, for example, in a classroom or you and I talking, verbal memory, compared to teens who did not have extensive alcohol use. And we also found that they used fewer strategies, different strategies, when they were trying to learn new information. And we thought that that was very important. And we followed these teens over time, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 years later now even. And we found that for those teens who continued, in addition to those memory and learning strategy differences, we found decrements or decreases in their attentional ability and their visual, spatial, or nonverbal memory. And that visual, spatial stuff would be things like you'd learn in a science class mm-hmm. or a math class, or learning directions, to get one place to another. And then finally, it also looks like, consistent with the animal research that mm-hmm. we now have, that high dose drinking, that is binge drinking, and especially if they have any withdrawal symptoms, that those are markers of higher risk for impairment. And so that's important for parents to know. So let me tell you just a little bit about that study I'm referring to, or give you an example. So for youth who had these 100 use episodes and met criteria for alcohol dependence, we gave them both tests that looked at verbal information, telling them stories, asking them how much they could remember mm-hmm. of those stories, and nonverbal tasks, figures. And we asked them to copy those figures, and we were seeing how much they remembered. And we compared youth who were alcohol dependent with other kids from their community who were the same age, who were in the same grades, who had the same socioeconomic status, the same density of family history, the same kinds of background in terms of family history of alcohol or drug problems. We matched them on gender, and the folks that were alcohol dependent, the teens, we made sure that they had at least 3 weeks of abstinence before we tested them. So we tested them at 3 weeks of abstinence, and we found that the information that they could get in immediately after we either told them these stories or we showed them the pictures was about the same. So they had recovered in terms of that new learning immediately, what they could remember immediately. But if we tested them just 20 minutes later and asked them the same questions about the stories, or we asked them to draw those figures again, they remembered about 10% less if they had a history of alcohol dependence. And it didn't matter whether we're talking about verbal things or whether we're talking about nonverbal memory. So if you think about it, it's like being in a classroom and the teacher's giving you an instruction and you feel like you're getting the same information. But if you have a pop quiz at the end of the class, you would do more poorly if you had that alcohol history. Or if you're studying the night before and preparing for a test, you could work just as hard, but do about 10% poorer. That's very important because that's the difference between an A and a B, or a B and a C, or passing or not passing a class in just 20 minutes. So this suggested to us that adolescents who had a history of heavy drinking over a protracted period of time were disadvantaged in the classroom environment. It's not just that they aren't as motivated, but if you get poorer grades, it's going to decrease your motivation. It's that there actually is at least some temporary impairment there that's going to last over at least 3 weeks before they can do as well as perhaps they could otherwise in the classroom. Very important, I think, for parents to know, for teachers to know, for counselors to know.
And for children to know.
And for children.
Because again, you know, like this smarty pants 16-year-old wants to know what he wants to know, wants to hear what he wants to hear. So I think that one of the things when we're doing these webinars, we'll be storing them, and we will be taking bits and pieces of them, because again, I wouldn't be optimistic that I would get my 16-year-old grandson to watch an hour of this.
Yes.
But I might get him to watch just the one thing that he wants to refute, right? Oh, well, Mama, it's like this. So I think as we do sound bites, you know, we live in a world of sound bites, right? So we're going to put sound bites up that maybe your children or other people can use, because we live in a world of misinformation.
Yes.
And we just think it's, well, that's the way it is. Well, again, the research isn't telling us that. So it's our job to get that research out to our children, to our families, to schools. I'm not sure even all the schools have all this. That one little bit of information for schools would be huge.
Well, I do think it's in part the difficulty believing some of this information is just the fact that alcohol is a seductive drug.
Very.
And what I mean by that is that if you were to ask a teen who had a lot of alcohol experience and a teen who did not, are they learning the same amount in the classroom? Well, you could see from that past slide that initially they do. But what they don't understand is what they can remember is a little bit less. And that's not so obvious for you or I or any teen. So that's what I mean when I say that alcohol is a seductive drug. You know, we think we're okay, but the effects are subtle and they're cumulative.
Right. And you know, one of those things that drives drug use always is the perception of harm. And if we perceive something as not being harmful, then our attitude is, well, so what's the problem?
Great point. Great point. And talking about harm, I did just say that it's not just a single episode that's going to impact your memory ability like that, but it is whether you continue to do that over time. So we have followed teens who've been in treatment and who've not been in treatment. And one of the things that we know is that if they continue to drink heavily, that it impacts their thinking ability. So for example, on the screen, I think the parents will see that this is a slide that shows that teens who do well after they've been in treatment, that is, they stay off of alcohol and off of other drugs primarily, they continue to do fine. But for teens who drink at any time in a 4-year period, and if that drinking causes them some withdrawal symptoms, we see decrements in their visual spatial memory abilities. And if, of course, if they've been drinking recently, they do worse. We follow teens up to 10 years now, into their mid-20s. And what we found there is something, frankly, I think that was a bit shocking and unexpected. And that is that youth who continue to drink heavily look as bad on their learning tests that we give, the neurocognitive tests that we give, as teens do who use alcohol and several other hardcore drugs. So that alcohol's effects on certain learning abilities can be as pronounced as many other drug effects combined. That was surprising to us 10 years later.
That's surprising to me.
Yes. So that's something that we just published a year or so ago because we completed the 10-year follow-ups from these teens that we had studied previously.
What's amazing to me about all this is, of course, our field is prevention.
Yes.
And so much, this is preventable. It's
Yes.
all preventable. But what is it that makes us decide? You know, I've often said if we see a 2-year-old out in the road, well, we don't think a moment. We grab that 2-year-old out of the road. But if we see a teen down at the mobile gas station getting a 6-pack, we do nothing. So it's not just about the teen. It is about us. It's about our behavior. We're not comfortable with it all.
I think we're not comfortable, and I think part of it is we don't think about it as being dangerous in the same way. We don't see the harm that's associated with it. And I think I mentioned a moment ago that part of that is because I see alcohol as a very seductive drug. You know, it's acceptable in our culture. The majority of the adults drink at least a little bit. And so we don't quite understand what the impact of alcohol is on adolescent brains relative to what adult drinking is like. You know, teens when they drink on average 4 to 5 drinks per episode. The average for adults when they drink in an evening is 1 to 2 drinks. And so that's a big difference.
That is a big difference.
And I mentioned that alcohol is seductive for adolescents. And one of the reasons it's seductive is that we think that adolescent brains learn to compensate because perhaps more easily in the initial stages of alcohol exposure. So what you see on the screen here is a study that we did a few years ago where we were looking at teen drinking and brain activity during one of those memory tasks. And these are slides that come from functional magnetic resonance imaging. And many of us have been in an MRI scanner where if you've had an injury and they're checking to see is there any soft tissue damage. Well, we put teens in a scanner and we looked at the functioning of their brain when we were asking them to do this memory task. And what we found was that for the 16-year-olds, for the non-drinkers compared to the heavy drinkers activated their brains more to accomplish the task than the non-drinkers. That is, they're sort of compensating. They're working harder to do the same thing, and they can do that.
Okay.
But then when we follow these people 4 years later, what we find is that the activation patterns have changed dramatically. So that the non-drinkers, they continue to activate the same types of regions that they activated before, a few differences because of maturity. But the heavy drinkers are unable to do that. They have lower activation, and they now start to perform more poorly on this task that they did just as well on when they were 16.
So they overcompensated when they were 16, but 4 years later, they weren't able to do that.
That's right. And so that's why I'm saying some of these effects are subtle and cumulative, and wouldn't be apparent to a 16-year-old because they did just as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's only later on that you can start to appreciate some of the impact of alcohol exposure. And one thing I want to highlight today is that I think what many people knew at the beginning of the webinar today, and that is that brains continue to change up to the mid-20s. We know that much more about that now than we did a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And an important thing to understand is that the parts of the brain that underlie emotion and coordination and physical skills and seem to develop before those things that we want our teens to learn to become young adults. That is planning, paying attention to long-term consequences, evaluating what they're doing, reflecting on what they're doing. Those are more frontal lobe type activities. And the development of the brain proceeds from the posterior to the anterior, from the back to the front. So the frontal lobes, the parts that help us with planning and problem solving and good decision making, are the last to develop. So if we're drinking in the midst of that, it wouldn't be surprising that the parts of the brain that might be most impacted are those ones that relate to good decision making and planning. And we know part of what we want for our children, at least I wanted for my children, was for them to grow up to know how to take care of themselves, to make good decisions for now and in the future. And it takes a lot of brain power to do that.
It does.
So it takes that kind of cortical control that I talked about that develops last, but it takes management of our emotions, and remember the emotions become very salient early on, and it also takes practice to implement that. And that's one thing I think that is important for parents to understand, that some of the risky behavior that we see in adolescents, that's very normal, because it's a result of the way the brain develops. But that said, something that we as parents and teachers and counselors can help with is to help our teens get practice in that process. It is true that practice makes things better, can improve the decision-making process, that we have some control over this, so that even though the neural development isn't quite as complete, and teens are more impacted by their feelings in making decisions or social peers in making their decisions than adults are, the practice alone can improve their abilities. And that's what we can target. I also am just a firm believer that if risk-taking or experimentation is a natural part of adolescence, it has to have some evolutionary significance. I think that it helps teens prepare for transitions they need to make. And if they weren't experimenting and doing these things independently, they'd never move out of the house.
Right.
And I don't know how many parents would want to be in that situation where every child continues to live in their home until they're adults. I know I didn't, and I love and adore my children who are now in their 20s. So risk-taking can be good or bad, and part of what we practice with them can help experimentation become a good process, because we can encourage them to do experimentations and to take risks in ways that are healthy and productive rather than self-damaging.
I was reading something recently that was just fascinating to me. It was saying to say to children, and especially they were talking about even elementary school, oh, you're so intelligent, is not nearly as effective as saying, oh, you really did a good job with that. Then they will try to repeat doing a good job. So your whole thing about people need to practice a behavior, I think it's so true, but somehow we lose that. We think that, oh, well, I told them, they got it, let's move on. But it isn't like that. You have to.
I think we're all concerned about our children's self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And we try to be very reinforcing and loving to our children and give them, unconditional love. And I think that that's very important, that they feel loved. It is equally important that their efforts are reinforced, because their efforts are what are going to be helpful for them in developing the skills to make good decisions as an adult. So that's a great point, that you want to talk about the effort, not just you're a great child,
Right.
but that what you did showed something very important about you, and that you can do this in the future.
And even if you failed, frequently we learn more from failure, because sometimes when you succeed, you put all
Yes.
kinds of things to it that maybe don't go with it. But when you fail at something, that's the opportunity to learn. And think about that in the
Yes.
brain and what you're saying. It's an opportunity to learn and then repeat and not do the same thing again.
It also teaches that reflection, or that self-evaluation, which is a critical part of how you and I function on a day-to-day basis. If we do something really foolish or stupid in a situation, if we were not able to learn from that, it would be harder for us to function in the future. We want our children to have that same
Mhm.
experience too. Mistakes are good.
Right.
Let me just recap a little bit so that we have enough time for questions. There are some things that we know about alcohol now and adolescent development that we didn't know a few years ago. For example, we know that teens who start earlier drinking, before age 14, for example, are at much greater risk for developing addiction. And we know that the earlier teens start, the faster they progress in terms of their alcohol involvement. So delaying the onset of alcohol use is a good thing. We also now appreciate that adolescent brains are kind of ideal for alcohol or drug abuse. That is, they're resistant to the sedative effects of alcohol. They condition rapidly. That sequence of maturation I talked about, where emotion and coordination develop first and the judgment part later on, that sort of sets them up for rapid use of alcohol. And brains are flexible. Adolescent brains are flexible. They're still developing, so they can compensate, but the impact comes from the slow cumulative effects that are not so obvious early on.
So that was the difference in the 16-year-old and the 20-year-old.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Good point. We know that lots of other things can affect us and place us at risk for alcohol problems and drug use and drug problems. There are personality characteristics that where youth might be more impulsive to begin with or more disinhibited. That places them at risk for early use. Things like alcohol expectancies, what they think is going to happen to them when they drink, and what they're learning from their families and from the media and from their peers. And I think you'll hear from Dr. Goldman, perhaps on another occasion, about how children as young as age 3 or 4 already know some things about alcohol long before they ever have their first drink. And now what we know from the neurocognitive and neuroimaging studies is that alcohol can actually affect the way the brain develops. The shorter term impact being primarily in the area of memory, but longer term in a whole variety of different domains. Things like the attention abilities, problem solving abilities, for example. As I mentioned, some risks are there before youth ever have a drink. We know that there are some things about the structure of the brain that might accentuate risk for progression if teens use alcohol, and inhibition is certainly one of those things. We know that boys and girls are different. Girls develop through puberty a bit earlier. Their brain matures in a slightly, not a different sequence, but in different timing than boys do. And there is some evidence to suggest that alcohol the girls may either be more vulnerable, or that alcohol may have a more adverse effect on girls than boys. And this comes from recent studies that focused on binge drinking for 12 to 14-year-olds and as they progress through adolescence. And they found that girls had who binge drink, as they start to binge drink, it impacts their comprehension, their understanding of material more than boys, and the interpretation of verbal information. We talked a little bit about visual information, about visual working memory before. And for boys, they tend, with the onset of binge drinking, it looks like it's their attention that's first impacted. And you might recall a little bit ago I mentioned that 10% difference in learning just after 20 minutes. We saw a 10% difference here in this study as well. Again, a difference between an A and a B and a C, so attention tends to be more impacted by the onset of binge drinking for boys, and comprehension and interpretation of visual information for girls. And again, there's slow cumulative effects. I guess another thing it's important for parents to know is that some groups just look like they're more vulnerable. If there's a family history of alcohol dependence, it's not necessarily that those youth are disadvantaged before they start to drink. It's if they start to drink, they may be more vulnerable to the effects of alcohol on the brain. And so we want to be careful about that. And so I just want to make that point, that family history of alcohol problems doesn't disadvantage those who don't drink, but once the drinking starts, alcohol can have a more pronounced effect. So what can we do? Remember we talked about how the brain develops, and there is this idea from neuroscience and behavioral sciences of what we call scaffolding. That is, how do we provide preventions and interventions that support healthy brain development with regard to alcohol and other drugs. So we said that the youthful brain, especially those who are exposed to heavy alcohol use, are probably not as good at planning, weighing negative consequences, or controlling our impulses. Those are the kinds of skills that are learned. We can teach them as parents, we can teach them as teachers and as counselors. And I do have a few ideas about how we might be able to help with attention, memory, and problem solving that we can apply in all these different contexts. And I call this parent. P is promoting activities that can capitalize on the strengths of the developing brain. So as children are starting to evidence planning, we have them practice those, weigh the consequences. We actually practice the things that we think are good, healthy things for them at that age. We want to assist them when they make mistakes. If they haven't considered something, help them learn to pause and weigh the pros and the cons of in their decision making. Whenever we see a teen reaching out to an adult, oftentimes outside the family, a mentor, a teacher, a counselor, etc., support that, reinforce that, because they are seeking advice, and this helps them with learning how to make good decisions. We want to encourage them, of course, in a lifestyle that will promote healthy brain development, so activities that can generate really good feelings for them, build their coordination early on, which many parents do anyway during the early adolescent years, and then focusing on those kinds of planful things and how these other activities can have long-term consequences for them. I suggest we never underestimate the impact of alcohol on the brain? Never.
Never.
And then if children do become engaged, and the majority of teens will have had a drink of alcohol before they graduate from high school, that we view those as opportunities for learning. So that if you catch your teen drinking, that you use that as an opportunity to do some of this discussion about problem solving and long-term consequences. And it's important for parents not to be afraid to talk to their adolescents about those episodes. If we don't talk to them, we're giving them the message that it's okay.
Okay. Well, a question that we get all the time, and that is, well, is it better to teach your teen to drink?
I think we held that fantasy for a while, because if we look at European countries, for example, where they have different drinking ages, and in some context, youth would drink in the context of multiple generations, and we thought, geez, they'd be learning how to drink in a reasonable fashion. They would be drinking like adults. Well, the international research now shows that they do learn that that's the way you drink when you're in the context of the family, but they just have greater access and accessibility, and they drink like teens drink in high volumes, binge drinking, when they're out with their peers. So you get both of those things happening at the same time, rather than just drinking like you would be drinking in the context of the family. Consequently, there are substantially higher rates of binge drinking in European countries that have more liberal laws, and there are more alcohol-related problems for adolescents, unfortunately.
Right, and we're just starting to get all of that data and information in. The World Health Organization, I think, has declared alcoholism as the #1 health problem facing the countries, and that we could do something about, that we could actually prevent.
Yes.
So I think the research is definitely changing. We may not like to hear what it's changing to. One of our Lunch and Learn webinars is going to be something called Listen Up, and it's a woman judge, and her son, who the son realizes that his friends really don't understand. He's a sophomore in high school, and he just realizes from seeing what his mother has to do every day that teenagers don't really understand the ramifications of this drinking and the partying thing. But we are also targeting the Listen Up to school administrators, because if they don't deliver that message to the parents, it won't be as, we can deliver it, but we need them to deliver it. So, hey, perfect, we're right on target. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Sandy, you've been wonderful.
My pleasure.